Potters have been fascinated by the human face for thousands of years. From the earliest ancient Moche pottery of Peru to 18th century English pottery, Face Jugs. But at the turn of the 19th century in America, interest began to develop among museums and researchers over jugs that began to turn up in the Northeast in collections and sometimes even on dig sites. These were jugs that exhibited a raw power that spoke to some kind of special use. And early researchers suspected that the genesis of these jugs was Africa. An early researcher by the name of Edwin Barber interviewed Beach Island, South Carolina potter and planter by the name of Colonel Davies. And this was during a survey Barber did of southern ceramics and potteries. Davies spoke to him of what he called roughly modeled jugs in the form of grotesque human faces on the front. And in the 1980s, Yale researcher Robert Farrow Thompson made this same African connection on these jugs. And the jugs exhibited glazes, styles, and clay bodies that were commonly used by potters in the old Edgefield district. But no evidence of the manufacture of face jugs in Edgefield had ever been found. The face jugs were avidly collected, and some of them today are incredibly valuable. Many Southerners resisted the idea that Africans were the originators of these jugs, pointing to English Toby jugs and other early white American potters in America as the possible source of these jugs. But that didn't turn out to be the case. Even Barber had noted that there had been an introduction of Congo natives, Africans, into the Edgefield pottery community in 1858, and we'll talk more about that later on. But it was not until 2006 that the debate was finally settled. That was when the Georgia Archaeological Institute was working on the Joseph Gregory Bainham site, which as we now know was the Lewis Miles Beaver Dam pottery site. And at one location, some distance away from the main pottery, we began to find a large deposit of face jug fragments, waster pieces. And it was clear that we had an area there. We had an area where a great many face jugs had been made. The PBS program History Detectives at the same time ran a segment on a face jug dug up by a plumber in Germantown, Philadelphia. And the plumber's daughter, April Hines, inherited this jug and was so interested in it that she began to research its history. After I appeared on the PBS segment, April contacted me and proposed that we work together to research the origins of the face jug, something I was already engaged in, and so this made good sense. When consulting with the Metropolitan Museum of New York on face jugs, and especially on her particular face jug, I found an exact match for this Germantown jug. And that was when Miss Hines and I began our archival research, and this is basically what we learned. In 1858, planter Charles Lamar took the slave ship Wanderer to Africa and returned with 407 enslaved Africans to Jekyll Island, Georgia. And many of those slaves came from the Zambezi River region of the Congo. It was a deliberate act in the face of a federal ban on importation of slaves into the United States. which had been in force for 50 years. Lamar wanted to enrich himself, but he also wanted to provoke further steps towards Southern secession. Of those slaves that were landed at Jekyll Island, some 200 were brought up the Savannah River into the old Edgefield district, and they went into plantations, and many of them went into the Potteries to work as turners and functionaries throughout the Potteries. 150 years later, I was able to meet with some of those descendants of those slaves at the Schomburg Institute in New York. With a grant from the Chipstone Foundation, I was able to film many of their stories. One of them brought a face jug made by a man from the Congo called Silukanji. That man was his great-grandfather. He was 10 when he made the passage across from America, and we know today that that man is known as Ward Lee. We also have one of the face jugs that Ward Lee made, and you can see it here in this video. Ward Lee made this jug many years after liberation. In fact, he continued to work in the Potteries, and for quite a long time became a successful cotton farmer, owned land, and established a family in South Carolina. So what significance did these startlingly powerful pieces of pottery have? Hundreds of years before 1858, the Portuguese converted many Africans of the Congo region to Christianity. The idea of an omnipresent God dovetailed with the African concept of spiritual power in nature, in everything. And the two beliefs were able to coexist. It was believed by the Africans that many substances in nature could be used to concentrate natural power so that it could be used for both good and bad purposes. The Nkonde Minkisi figure is an example of how this power was used. Powerful substances were sealed in a belly cavity in the figure, and a nail or a metal blade was then used to be driven into the object and activate the power and direct it towards the desired outcome. The jug body had clearly been thrown by an experienced, competent potter. But it was also obvious that a second person, and perhaps the conjurer himself, had added the modelling, the eyes, the nose, mouth, teeth, to the wet clay body before it was dipped in a glaze and fired. Chipstone provided me with a grant to go through this process with potter David Lenzo, and we reconstructed a number of jugs to explore the way they could have been put together. And it pretty much confirmed our conclusion that there had to have been two people involved in making each of these jugs or cups or other vessels, and you'll see those in other programs. My continued research in Edgefield and elsewhere continues to show me that many of these jugs are still held by families in Edgefield. They have them on mantles and on basements, and they're fairly private about them, and it's clear that they still regard these as objects of power, objects of importance, and certainly objects of importance to their personal story as the descendants of slaves that were brought to America illegally in 1858.
This is the generation, I think, we're just far enough removed from the pain of the struggle itself that it's important to know, where you come from. You can't move forward if you have no idea the struggles of your ancestors. You really cannot. And to know, I want my children to know exactly where they came from, and the struggles that were endured.
And it is no wonder that new face jugs are made by many potters, most of them white. Mark Bainham may well have been the first white potter to make an Africanized face jug. But you'll find links to the Chipstone article and the History Detectives program and a transcript of this little program at thearchaeologyhour.com.